He thought she didn't belong there, just another woman wandering into a place she could never afford. But in less than 10 minutes, that quiet assumption would cost him everything. The glass doors of Carter Elite Motors slid open with a soft whisper, letting in a beam of late afternoon sunlight that stretched across the polished marble floor like a spotlight waiting for its subject. And right into that light stepped Emily Carter, her presence almost too simple for a place that thrived on extravagance. Dressed in a plain white blouse, light denim jeans, and worn sneakers that echoed softly against the pristine showroom as if apologizing for being there. Yet her eyes were steady, observant, taking in the rows of gleaming vehicles priced well into six figures, machines that most people only ever admired from a distance. And for a brief moment, no one approached her, not because they didn't notice, but because they already had. Behind the reception desk, two sales associates exchanged a quick glance, the kind that required no words, the kind that categorized people in seconds. And near the center of the showroom, Mark Reynolds adjusted his tailored navy suit, his reflection sharp against the glossy surface of a midnight black coupe, his gaze lifting just enough to catch sight of Emily, lingering on her outfit a second too long before a faint smirk curled at the edge of his lips, subtle, practiced, the kind of expression that never quite crossed the line into something obvious, but carried enough weight to be felt. Emily walked slowly toward a silver luxury sedan displayed on a raised platform, her fingers brushing lightly against the air near its polished surface, not quite touching, as though respecting the invisible barrier that wealth often builds. And when she finally turned, scanning the room for assistance, her voice was calm, almost gentle when she spoke. "Excuse me, could I get some information about this model?" But the response didn't come immediately. Instead, there was a pause, a deliberate hesitation that stretched just long enough to make her question if she had been heard at all, until Mark began walking toward her, each step measured, confident, the rhythm of authority echoing faintly in the vast space, his smile appearing only when he was close enough to be polite. "That's one of our premium models," he said, his tone smooth but distant, eyes flicking briefly down to her shoes before returning to her face. "Not something we usually show without an appointment." The words hung lightly, almost casual, but the implications settled heavier in the air and around them. The showroom seemed to quiet just a little, conversations softening, a few customers glancing over with quiet curiosity, drawn not by volume, but by tension, subtle and growing. Emily nodded once, unfazed on the surface, her expression unchanged. "I understand, but I'd like to learn more about it. Is it possible to take it for a test drive?" For a split second, Mark's smile tightened, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and he let out a short, controlled breath as if amused by something only he could see. "Test drives are reserved for serious buyers," he replied, his voice still polite, but now carrying an edge, a boundary carefully drawn. "We like to ensure our vehicles are handled appropriately." A faint ripple moved through the nearby staff, one of them lowering their gaze, another pretending to rearrange brochures, the atmosphere shifting just enough to be noticed, and Emily stood there, still composed, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady, not reacting the way most people would, not shrinking, not arguing, just absorbing the moment with a quiet patience that felt almost out of place. The sunlight shifted slightly as clouds passed overhead, dimming the brightness in the showroom, and for a brief second, everything felt suspended, like a scene waiting for something unseen to enter, something that would change the direction of every glance in that room, though no one there. Not Mark, not the watching customers, not even the staff holding their breath in subtle anticipation, had any idea that the next set of footsteps approaching the glass doors would bring with them a silence, far heavier than anything that had come before. Mark let the silence stretch just long enough to establish control, his posture relaxed but calculated as he gestured vaguely toward the back of the showroom where lower-priced vehicles were displayed, the implication clear without ever being spoken directly, and Emily followed the motion with her eyes for a brief moment before returning her gaze to him, calm and unwavering, as if she had heard this conversation many times before in different places with different faces. "I am a serious buyer," she said softly, her voice steady and measured, not defensive, not confrontational, just factual, and for a split second, something flickered in Mark's expression, not doubt, but irritation at the disruption of his narrative, because people in her position were supposed to hesitate, to second-guess themselves, to back away quietly, not stand still with quiet certainty. Around them, the air seemed to tighten as a couple browsing nearby slowed their steps, pretending to examine a brochure while clearly listening, and one of the junior associates behind the desk shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Mark and Emily, as if sensing that something about this exchange was beginning to tilt off balance. Mark gave a short, polite chuckle, the kind that sounded friendly but carried a dismissive undertone. "Of course," he replied, folding his hands loosely in front of him, "and I am sure you are. But vehicles like this require a certain level of commitment before we allow them out on the road. We have to be careful with who we extend that privilege to." The word privilege landed heavier than he intended, echoing faintly in the open space, and Emily's eyes moved briefly to the car again, the sleek lines of its design catching the dimming light, before she spoke once more. "Then perhaps you can explain what that level of commitment looks like." There was no sarcasm in her tone, no challenge, just a simple question, and that simplicity made it harder to dismiss, harder to brush aside, forcing Mark into a corner he did not expect to be in, and for a moment, he hesitated, just a fraction too long, before recovering with a practiced smile. "Typically, our clients have established relationships with us," he said, his voice smooth again, "or at least provide proof of funds before we move forward with something. Like a test drive." A faint murmur rippled through the nearby customers, subtle but present, and the junior associate lowered his gaze completely now, focusing on a stack of papers that did not need organizing, while Emily absorbed the words without visible reaction, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, as if the conversation was unfolding exactly as she expected. "I see," she said quietly, nodding once. And there was a pause after that, a quiet space where most people would either argue or leave, but Emily did neither. She simply remained where she was, her presence steady, grounded, and that stillness began to shift something intangible in the room, a subtle discomfort that spread through the staff who were used to quick resolutions, to customers who either complied or disappeared. Not this quiet persistence that refused to escalate, yet refused to retreat. Mark cleared his throat, the sound slightly sharper than before. "If you would like, I can have someone show you our pre-owned inventory," he offered, his tone polite, but firmer now, drawing a clear line. And that was when Emily finally allowed a small breath to pass through her lips, not a sigh of frustration, but something closer to patience reaching its edge, though her voice remained calm when she spoke again. "No, thank you. I am interested in this one." The firmness in her words was subtle but unmistakable, and it lingered in the air just long enough to be felt by everyone within earshot. And for the first time, Mark's confidence wavered, not outwardly, not enough for anyone to call it out, but in the slight tightening of his jaw, the brief narrowing of his eyes as he recalculated the situation in front of him, because this was no longer a simple dismissal, no longer a routine interaction he could control with a smile and a suggestion. Something had shifted, something he could not quite define, and just as he opened his mouth to respond again, a faint sound echoed from the far end of the showroom, the low hum of doors opening, followed by the distinct, measured rhythm of footsteps against marble, steady, unhurried, and carrying a weight that made the nearest associate instinctively straighten their posture, though no one had yet turned to see who had entered, and Emily did not look toward the sound, not immediately, as if she already knew exactly who it was, while Mark remained focused on her, unaware that the ground beneath his certainty had already begun to move. The sound of those footsteps did not rush, did not demand attention, yet somehow they pulled it anyway, like gravity quietly shifting the room, and one by one, heads began to turn, subtle at first, then undeniable, as a tall man in a charcoal suit walked in through the glass doors with an ease that did not need to announce itself, his presence calm but precise. Every detail from the cut of his jacket to the steady rhythm of his stride suggesting someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone. And near the reception desk, one of the associates straightened immediately, his voice lowering as he whispered to a colleague, while another adjusted her posture as if instinctively aware that something important had just entered the space. Mark did not notice at first, his attention still fixed on Emily, still holding onto the last threads of control in the conversation. "I believe I have been more than accommodating," he said, his tone tightening slightly, the polished edge beginning to crack beneath the surface. "If you are not interested in exploring other options, I will have to ask you to step aside so I can assist other clients." The words were firm now, no longer wrapped in polite suggestion, and a few customers nearby exchanged glances, the tension no longer subtle but tangible, pressing into the air like a quiet pressure system building before a storm. Emily met his gaze without flinching, her expression unchanged, her voice just as calm as before. "I am already a client," she said, and for a fraction of a second, Mark blinked, not because he believed her, but because the statement did not fit the version of reality he had constructed, and that small disruption, that single unexpected line, created a crack he did not yet recognize. Behind him, the footsteps continued, drawing closer, each step echoing more clearly against the marble floor, and now the associates near the entrance were no longer pretending not to notice, one of them even stepping forward slightly, as if preparing to greet the man, but stopping just short, waiting, watching. Mark let out a quiet breath through his nose, a faint smile returning, though it carried none of the earlier ease. "Then perhaps you should have mentioned that earlier," he replied, his tone edged with restrained impatience. "Because from where I stand, you walked in without an appointment, without identification, and without any indication that you are prepared to make a purchase at this level." The statement lingered, heavier than intended, and the room seemed to hold on to it, amplifying its weight, and Emily tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the words without accepting them, her eyes steady, thoughtful, as if considering something far beyond the moment itself. "I did not realize I needed to prove anything to ask a question," she said quietly, and the simplicity of her response landed with a clarity that cut through the tension more sharply than any raised voice could have, causing the junior associate behind the desk to glance up briefly before looking away again, as if caught between two realities he did not know how to reconcile. And then, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was different from before, deeper, more deliberate, as if the entire room had paused in recognition of something unspoken, and a voice, calm and measured, broke through the stillness from just behind Mark. "Is there a problem here?" It was not loud, not forceful, yet it carried across the showroom with an authority that did not need volume to be felt, and Mark's expression shifted instantly, the practiced confidence faltering as he turned, his body reacting before his mind fully caught up, and when his eyes landed on the man standing there, something in his posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, his shoulders straightening, his tone recalibrating before he even spoke. "Sir, I was just handling a situation," Mark began, his voice smoother now, almost deferential. "This customer was—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, the word hanging unfinished as his gaze flickered between the man and Emily, something clicking into place too slowly, like a realization arriving one piece at a time, and behind him, the staff had gone completely still, no one moving, no one speaking, the entire showroom suspended in a quiet awareness that something had just shifted beyond anyone's control. Emily finally turned her head toward the man, her expression softening ever so slightly, not with surprise, not with relief, but with a quiet recognition that felt entirely out of place in the tension surrounding them. And for the first time since she had walked through those doors, there was the faintest hint of warmth in her eyes, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived, while Mark stood there, caught between what he thought he knew and what was beginning to unfold right in front of him, unaware that every word he had spoken was about to be weighed in a way he could not take back. The air shifted in a way that no one could quite explain, as if the room itself had quietly decided to change sides, and Mark felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle tightening in his chest, the sudden awareness of how still everyone had become, and the man standing in front of him did not raise his voice, did not step closer, yet somehow filled the space with a calm authority that made every polished surface and quiet whisper seem to fall into alignment around him. "This customer was asking for a test drive without meeting our requirements," Mark continued, forcing his tone into something controlled, something professional, though the confidence beneath it had begun to thin, and the man listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his eyes steady, not on Mark alone, but briefly moving to Emily. And in that single glance, something unspoken passed between them. Something that did not belong to this moment, but had been built long before it. "I see," the man said finally, his voice even, measured, carrying just enough weight to settle over the room like a quiet command. And he took a small step forward, not toward Mark, but toward Emily, closing the distance with an ease that felt intentional, deliberate, as if every movement was chosen rather than reactive. "Were you assisted properly?" he asked, his tone softening slightly as he looked at her. And for the first time since she had entered the showroom, Emily allowed the faintest smile to touch her lips, subtle, almost invisible unless someone was paying close attention. "I was being told what I could not do," she replied, her voice calm, her words simple, yet they landed with a clarity that echoed far louder than they should have. And behind them, one of the associates shifted his weight, another lowered her gaze, the collective awareness of the room sharpening with every second. Mark straightened slightly, stepping forward just enough to reclaim his position, though the movement felt less certain now, less anchored. "Sir, we have policies in place to protect our vehicles and our brand," he said, his words carefully chosen, each one an attempt to rebuild the ground beneath him. "We cannot simply allow anyone to." He stopped again, the sentence catching in his throat as the man turned his head toward him, not sharply, not aggressively, but with a precision that cut through the noise of the moment, and the silence that followed was immediate, absolute, the kind that made even the faint hum of the air conditioning feel too loud. "Anyone," the man repeated, not as a challenge, but as a quiet question, and the word lingered, heavier than before, forcing Mark to hear it in a way he had not intended. And for a brief second, his composure faltered completely, the carefully constructed professionalism slipping just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath it. The man held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at Emily, his posture relaxed, his presence unwavering. "Would you still like to take that test drive?" he asked, as if the answer had never been in doubt, and Emily nodded once, her expression composed, her eyes steady. "Yes," she said simply, and the room seemed to exhale all at once, though no one dared to speak. Mark's jaw tightened, the realization now forming in full, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable shift that he could no longer ignore. The way the staff stood a little straighter, the way no one interrupted, the way this man spoke without needing to assert himself. And it was in those details that the truth began to settle, piece by piece, until it could no longer be dismissed. "Of course," Mark said quickly, his tone changing, softer now, almost eager. "I can arrange that immediately." But the words felt different this time, not like an offer, not like a choice, but like a correction arriving too late. The man did not respond right away, his eyes moving once more across the showroom, taking in the staff, the customers, the silent witnesses to the exchange. And when he finally spoke, his voice was still calm, still controlled, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that carried consequence without needing to declare it. "No," he said quietly, and the single word stopped everything, cutting through Mark's attempt to recover, freezing him mid-breath. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire room suspended in a silence that felt heavier than before, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided long before anyone realized what was at stake. The word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, a quiet refusal that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, and Mark felt it settle over him like a realization he could no longer avoid, his mouth parting slightly as if to respond. But no words came, because for the first time since this interaction began, he was no longer in control of it. The man did not look at him again immediately, instead turning his attention fully to Emily, his expression calm, composed, yet now unmistakably personal, as if the distance between them had never truly existed in the first place. "You should not have to ask twice," he said softly, and there was no anger in his tone, no outward frustration, just a quiet certainty that made the statement land deeper than any reprimand. And Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, the faint smile returning, not triumphant, not vindictive, but understanding, as though she had anticipated every step that led to this point. Behind them, the showroom had fallen completely silent, The kind of silence that made even the smallest movements feel amplified. A pen being set down, a breath being held, the subtle shift of someone's stance, all of it echoing in the absence of conversation, and every pair of eyes remained fixed on the two figures now standing at the center of the room. Mark swallowed, the motion small but visible, his posture adjusting again, no longer confident, no longer certain, but searching for something to hold on to. Sir, if there has been a misunderstanding, I assure you that we can resolve this immediately, he said quickly, his voice careful, measured, but lacking the earlier ease, and the man finally turned his head toward him again, not abruptly, not sharply, but with a controlled precision that made the moment feel deliberate, intentional. There was no misunderstanding, he replied, his tone even, and the simplicity of those words stripped away any remaining illusion Mark might have held on to, leaving only the reality of what had just occurred. And for a second, Mark's eyes flickered, the pieces aligning too clearly now, the posture of the staff, the silence in the room, the way this man spoke without needing to assert authority, and something in his expression shifted. Not fully recognition, not yet, but close enough to feel like the edge of something irreversible. The man stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself beside Emily rather than in front of her, a subtle movement that spoke louder than any declaration, placing them not as strangers in a transaction, but as something else entirely, something that the room was beginning to understand without being told. You mentioned protecting the brand, he continued, his gaze steady on Mark. Tell me, what do you believe that means? The question was simple, but it landed with a weight that forced Mark to answer, to define something he had only ever used as a shield, and for a moment, he hesitated, searching for the right words, the safe words. It means maintaining a certain standard, ensuring that our clients receive the level of service they expect, he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, and the man nodded once, acknowledging the answer without agreeing to it. And does that standard include deciding who deserves respect based on appearance, he asked, and this time, the silence that followed was sharper, more pointed, cutting through the room like a line that could not be crossed without consequence, and Mark's breath caught, just for a fraction of a second, before he shook his head slightly. No, sir, that was not my intention, he replied quickly, though the words felt thin against the weight of the moment. The man studied him for a brief second longer, then let the silence settle again, not as punishment, but as space for the truth to exist without interruption. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, unchanged, but there was something final in it now, something that signaled the end of this moment as Mark had known it. Intent does not change impact, he said quietly, and the words did not echo loudly, but they stayed, lingering in the air long after they were spoken, settling into the awareness of everyone who heard them. And in that stillness, the truth became unavoidable, not just for Mark, but for every person in the room who had watched, who had listened, who had chosen silence until now. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her gaze moving once across the showroom, not searching, not judging, simply observing, and then back to the man beside her, her voice calm as she spoke. It is all right, she said, and there was no bitterness in her tone, no need for validation, just a quiet acceptance that made the moment feel complete in a way no apology could replicate. And the man nodded once, acknowledging her words, but not dismissing what had happened, because some things, once revealed, could not simply be undone. And as the silence settled once more, heavier than before, the room understood something it had not before, that respect was never about who walked through the door, but how they were seen when they did. And on that polished marble floor, beneath the quiet glow of showroom lights, that truth stood clearer than ever. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the kind of quiet that forces every person in the room to confront what they had just witnessed. And Mark stood there, no longer searching for words but for footing, for something solid. Beneath him that no longer existed, his confidence not shattered, but stripped away layer by layer until only the truth remained, exposed and undeniable. The man beside Emily did not raise his voice, did not gesture, yet his presence alone held the room in place. And when he finally spoke again, it was not to correct, not to argue, but to conclude. This dealership was built on trust, he said calmly, his tone steady, measured, not assumptions. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that settled into the polished walls and glass surfaces, reflecting back at everyone who stood there. And Mark lowered his gaze for the first time, not out of submission, but out of realization, the kind that arrives too late to be prevented, but just in time to be remembered. One of the senior associates near the reception desk stepped forward slightly, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "Mr. Carter, would you like me to prepare the vehicle?" he asked, and the name landed quietly. But it moved through the room like a shift in gravity, subtle yet immediate, and Mark's head lifted just enough for the meaning to register fully, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before he caught himself. But it was already too late. The recognition had arrived, and with it, the understanding of exactly who he had been speaking to, exactly who he had dismissed, exactly what he had failed to see. Daniel Carter did not respond right away, his gaze moving once across the showroom, taking in the staff, the customers, the silence, and then back to Emily, his expression softening again, the authority giving way to something quieter, more personal. "Would you still like to see the car?" he asked her, and Emily glanced once more at the silver sedan, the one she had approached when she first walked in, the one that had started all of this, and then back at him, her voice calm. "Yes," she said, as if nothing about the moment had changed her intention, only clarified it. Daniel nodded once, then turned slightly toward the associate who had spoken. "Prepare it," he said, and there was no hesitation, no need for further instruction, the associate moving immediately, his posture straight, his movements precise, while the rest of the staff remained still, absorbing what had just unfolded, the weight of it settling differently for each person in the room. Mark took a small step back, not consciously, but instinctively, creating space where there had been none before, his hands coming together in front of him as if to steady himself, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "Mr. Carter, he began, but the words faltered, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that anything he said would come too late to change what had already been revealed. Daniel turned his head slightly, acknowledging him without fully facing him. "You will review our client experience policies," he said calmly, not as a suggestion, not as a reprimand, but as a decision already made. "And you will remember that every person who walks through those doors is a reflection of who we choose to be." The statement was not loud, not dramatic, yet it carried more weight than any public correction could have, and Mark nodded once, slowly, the motion deliberate, accepting not just the instruction, but the lesson behind it, the realization settling into him in a way that would not fade easily. Across the showroom, the vehicle was being prepared, the engine brought to life with a quiet hum, the sound blending into the stillness rather than breaking it, and Emily watched for a moment before turning back toward Daniel, her expression composed, her presence unchanged from when she first walked in, as if the entire experience had not altered her, only revealed something in others. Together, they began to walk toward the car, their steps unhurried, aligned, and as they moved, the room seemed to shift with them, not in noise, not in movement, but in awareness, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. And behind them, Mark remained where he stood, not frozen, not defeated, but quiet, reflecting, the echo of his earlier words still present, now understood in a way they had not been before. The marble floor carried the sound of their footsteps forward, steady and even, and for the first time since the doors had opened, the space felt different, not because of what had happened, but because of what had been seen, and in that quiet transformation, something far more lasting than a single moment of embarrassment had taken place, something that would remain long after the showroom returned to its usual rhythm, a reminder that respect, once tested, reveals exactly where it stands. The engine's quiet hum seemed to settle into the space like a final note, steady and controlled, as the silver sedan was brought forward with precision, its polished surface reflecting the overhead lights in soft waves, and Emily paused beside it for just a moment, her fingers now resting gently against the door handle, no longer held back by invisible boundaries, no longer second-guessing whether she belonged there, while Daniel stood a step behind her, not leading, not directing, simply present, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it should. A young associate hurried to open the driver's side door, his movements careful, almost reverent now, as if the car itself had taken on a new meaning. And as Emily stepped inside, the leather seat settling beneath her, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not excitement, not relief, but a quiet confirmation, as though this had never been about proving anything, only about being seen without judgment. Daniel leaned slightly toward the open door, his voice low, steady. "Take your time," he said, and she nodded once, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the interior with calm focus, while outside, the showroom remained still, the staff no longer pretending to work, no longer avoiding the moment, but watching with a new awareness, one that carried a quiet weight of reflection. Mark stood farther back now, near the edge of the display floor, his posture no longer commanding, no longer central, but withdrawn, not out of instruction, but instinct, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. And in that gaze was something different from before, not arrogance, not dismissal, but recognition, the kind that arrives after the moment has passed, when there is nothing left to defend. The junior associate who had earlier avoided eye contact now watched openly, his expression thoughtful, as if replaying every word that had been spoken, every glance that had been exchanged, and somewhere in that reflection, a quiet understanding began to take shape, not just about what had happened, but about what it revealed. Emily adjusted the mirrors, her movements smooth and unhurried, and when she stepped out of the vehicle a moment later, her expression remained composed, unchanged, as if the test drive itself had never been the point. And Daniel met her gaze with a small nod, one that required no words, and together they began walking toward the exit, their pace steady, aligned, leaving behind the car, the showroom, and the silence that still lingered in their wake. No one stopped them, no one spoke, not because they were told to remain silent, but because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. Mark took a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling as if the weight of the moment had finally settled fully. And though he remained where he stood, there was a shift in him, subtle but real, the kind that does not come from being corrected, but from seeing something clearly for the first time. Across the room, the senior associate returned to his position, but his posture was different now, less mechanical, more aware, as though the routine of the day had been quietly rewritten, and the customers who had witnessed the exchange began to move again, their conversations softer, more thoughtful, carrying with them the echo of what they had just seen. The glass doors opened once more as Emily and Daniel stepped outside, the late afternoon light welcoming them back into the world beyond the showroom. And as they disappeared from view, the space behind them did not return to what it had been, not immediately, because something had changed, not in the structure of the building, not in the cars or the policies, but in the people who remained, in the way they now looked at the next person who might walk through those doors, and in that quiet shift, unseen yet undeniable, the true impact of the moment began to reveal itself, not as a single event, but as a lasting reminder that dignity, once challenged, has a way of redefining everything it touches. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the dealership lot, the light warm but fading, casting everything in a softer tone that felt almost reflective, and Emily paused for a moment beside the row of vehicles, her gaze drifting across them not with desire, but with quiet clarity, as if what had just happened inside had already reshaped how this place felt to her, while Daniel stood beside her, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture unchanged, yet his presence carried a subtle attentiveness, as though he was not observing the cars, but the moment itself. "You handled that better than most would," he said calmly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them. And Emily let out a small breath, not a sigh, not relief, just a natural release of tension that had never fully surfaced. "It was not about handling it," she replied, her eyes still forward. "It was about not becoming it." The words settled between them, simple, yet layered with meaning, and Daniel nodded once, understanding without needing further explanation, because he had seen it, the restraint, the quiet strength, the refusal to meet arrogance with the same energy, and in that restraint, something far more powerful had taken place than any confrontation could have achieved. Behind them, through the glass walls, the showroom was visible, the staff moving again, slower, more deliberate, their earlier confidence replaced with a kind of awareness that could not be undone, and Mark stood near the reception desk now, speaking quietly with the senior associate, his posture still composed, but different, less rigid, less certain, as if the structure he relied on had shifted just enough to require rebuilding. Inside, a young associate approached him hesitantly, asking a question in a lowered voice, and Mark listened, not dismissively, not impatiently, but fully, his response measured, thoughtful, and though the change was subtle, it was there, visible to anyone who cared to look closely. Emily followed Daniel toward a dark blue sedan, parked a few spaces down, her steps unhurried, and when she stopped beside it, she turned to him, her expression calm. "I still want to get the car," she said, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no trace of what had happened lingering in her decision, and Daniel allowed a faint smile to appear, not surprised, not amused, but respectful. "Then we will make sure it is done the right way," he replied, and the emphasis was not on the purchase, but on the experience, the way it should have been from the beginning. A light breeze moved through the lot, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic, the world continuing as it always did, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place within those glass walls. And Emily glanced once more toward the showroom, her gaze steady, not lingering on any one person, but acknowledging the space as a whole, and then she turned away, her focus forward, her presence grounded. Inside, the atmosphere continued to adjust, conversations quieter, movements more intentional, and the senior associate gathered the team briefly, his voice low but firm, reinforcing expectations, not as correction, but as reminder, and Mark listened without interruption, his attention focused, absorbing each word, not defensively, but reflectively, and when the meeting ended, he remained where he stood for a moment longer, looking out through the glass toward the lot, toward the place where Emily and Daniel had stood, as if trying to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. The reflection of the showroom lights shimmered faintly across the glass, blending with the fading daylight outside, creating a layered image of two worlds meeting at a single point. And in that quiet intersection, something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would stay, in the way a person pauses before making an assumption, in the way a voice softens before speaking, in the way respect becomes a choice rather than an expectation. Emily and Daniel continued walking, their figures gradually moving beyond the edge of the lot, the sound of their footsteps fading into the rhythm of the evening, and behind them, the dealership remained, not as it had been, but as it now was, shaped not by policy or presentation, but by a moment that revealed something deeper, something that could not be unseen. And as the light dimmed and the day moved toward its quiet close, that realization lingered, steady and clear, like a reflection that refuses to fade. The evening settled fully over the dealership, the sky turning a muted shade of amber fading into blue, and inside, the lights remained bright. But something about them felt different now, less like a stage for appearances and more like a space that had been quietly recalibrated. And Mark stood alone near the same silver sedan that had started it all, his reflection staring back at him from the polished surface, no longer sharp with confidence, but softened by something deeper, something more honest, and for the first time in a long while, he did not look away. The echoes of the afternoon lingered in his mind, not as a single moment, but as a sequence of choices, each one clearer now than it had been when he made it. And in that clarity, there was no anger, no defensiveness, only understanding, the kind that does not demand forgiveness but invites change. Across the showroom, a couple entered quietly, their footsteps light, their expressions curious, and for a brief second, Mark watched them the way he always had, instinctively measuring, categorizing, but this time, the thought paused before it completed, interrupted by something new, something that had not been there before, and instead of turning away or waiting, he stepped forward. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm, steady, without assumption, without edge, and the couple looked at him with mild surprise, not because of what he said, but how he said it, and he gestured gently toward the vehicles, not directing, not guiding, simply offering, "Let me know how I can help." The moment was small, almost invisible, but it carried a weight that no one else in the room could fully understand. because it was not about service, it was about intention, and as the couple nodded and began to speak, Mark listened, not preparing his response, not anticipating their budget or their status, but listening, fully present in a way that felt unfamiliar, yet right. Near the reception desk, the junior associate noticed the interaction, his eyes lingering for a moment before he returned to his work, a faint shift in his own posture following, as if the lesson of the day had found more than one place to settle. In the office above the showroom, Daniel stood by the window, looking out over the lot, the fading light reflecting faintly against the glass, and Emily stood beside him, her arms relaxed at her sides, her gaze calm as she observed the quiet transformation below, not searching for acknowledgement, not expecting anything, simply witnessing the ripple of what had begun hours earlier. "It is already changing," she said softly, and Daniel nodded, not as confirmation, but as recognition, because he understood that change rarely arrives in grand gestures, but in moments like these, small, steady, and lasting. The hum of the building continued, steady and familiar, but beneath it, something else had taken root, something that would shape the next interaction and the one after that, in ways that could not be measured, only felt. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped below the horizon, leaving the dealership illuminated against the darkening sky, a place that looked the same from a distance, unchanged in structure, unchanged in appearance, yet fundamentally different in the quiet ways that matter most. Inside, Mark finished assisting the couple, his movements smooth, his tone respectful, and when they thanked him, it was not out of obligation, but genuine appreciation, and as he watched them walk away, there was no need for validation, no need for recognition, only a quiet sense that something had been set right. He turned back toward the showroom, his reflection catching briefly in the glass once more, and this time, he did not pause, did not hesitate, because the person he saw there was no longer defined by assumption, but by awareness. And in that space, under the steady glow of the lights, the lesson of the day remained, not spoken, not displayed, but present in every interaction that followed, a quiet reminder that respect is not reserved for those who appear to deserve it, but revealed in how it is given, and that sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with a loud correction, but with a single moment of clarity that reshapes everything that comes after.